I was saying to Dennis a couple of minutes ago that it's clear that Heather is already spreading her bad attitude and interpersonal poison into yet another department. It is a delight to be here. So if you look at the program, you see that the four of us are on two different talks, and the way that we divided things up was to have Heather and Dennis do the second talk, and to have Dan and me do the first talk. I'm actually going to do the talking part, and Dan's going to answer all of the questions. Q&A. Quick overview. As some of you may know, the four of us co-authored a paper on the concept of intellectual humility in 2015. And in some ways, I'm just going to be giving you an overview of that view of intellectual humility. But I also am adding a couple of my own little twists that my co-authors may or may not agree with. And then the last half, or third at least, probably half of the presentation will address at some length one particular objection to our view that's been raised in the literature. And I'm afraid that it's at that point where those of you who aren't philosophers are going to have to like sit up straight and open your eyes really wide and hopefully do your best to track the discussion. Maybe that won't be necessary. I'm just letting you know that we'll be getting into some deeper philosophical weeds towards the end of the presentation. Okay, so I think one helpful way to come at our account of intellectual humility is by observing the role that intellectual limitations play in our cognitive lives. So as a species and as individuals, intellectual limitations pervade our existence. We're limited in what we can know, we're limited in how we can know it. Our senses are fallible, our memories are prone to error. We tend to reason beyond the evidence that we possess. The evidence that we possess tends to be biased in various ways. We think more highly than we should of our epistemic expertise or abilities. We're often lazy or give up or careless in our search for the truth. We're limited cognitively in myriad ways. Moreover, we're often ignorant of or oblivious to or in denial about the existence of our intellectual limitations. Or even when we're aware of them, often we do what we can to hide our intellectual limitations from ourselves, from others, and when we can't do that any longer, we're often irritated and defensive when those limitations are exposed. So I want to call that attitude toward our limitations a kind of resistance to becoming aware of or admitting or taking responsibility for our intellectual limitations, and the issue or the problem of intellectual pride. And if it is a problem, insofar as there is a problem of intellectual pride for us, what we need is some sort of disposition or orientation that would help us reckon more successfully, more reasonably with our cognitive limitations and our initial resistance to becoming aware of or taking responsibility for those limitations. And so, if you know anything about our view, our notion of intellectual humility is designed to play exactly that role. It's the orientation or disposition or character trait that we need in order to reckon well with our intellectual limitations, particularly in the face of tendencies or impulses toward intellectual pride. In that sense, I think it's useful, though we don't talk about it in this way in our paper, I think it's useful to think of intellectual humility as a corrective virtue, that it's corrective of intellectual pride. Okay, so in a sentence, our account of intellectual humility is as follows. Here and at a few other points I'll quote from our paper. Intellectual humility consists in proper attentiveness to and owning of one's intellectual limitations. There are three main parts of that definition that I'll unpack in a little bit more detail. First, this idea of intellectual limitations. By intellectual limitations, we mean something very broad. It includes, among other things, gaps in our knowledge, various cognitive errors or mistakes that we make, unreliable cognitive processes that we use, deficits that we possess in learnable skills, as well as intellectual character flaws. So it's a very broad notion of intellectual limitations. When we say that an intellectually humble person is properly attentive to their limitations, what we're getting at is the idea that a person can't be intellectually humble and be culpably oblivious to what their intellectual limitations are. You can't lack total self-awareness when it comes to your intellectual limitations and still be intellectually humble. Nor can you be in denial about those limitations. So minimally, to be intellectually humble is to be attentive to, properly attentive to our intellectual limitations. Now, what counts as properly attentive to? That's a difficult question. Here's a very rough first pass at an answer. An intellectually humble person is properly attentive to, or excuse me, this captures what proper attentiveness looks like. An intellectually humble person is attentive to her limitations when these limitations might negatively interfere with her intellectual activity. So if I've got some intellectual weakness or deficit that isn't relevant to what I'm thinking or reasoning about in a given moment, intellectual humility doesn't require being aware of or attending to that limitation in that context. But where that limitation might interfere with my cognitive activity and disrupt that activity, it's at that point where, if I'm intellectually humble, I will be attentive to that limitation. The limitation will be on my radar, so to speak. But it's not enough to just be aware of our limitations, even appropriately attentive to those limitations, because a person can be attentive to their limitations, but be disposed to conceal or deny or be defensive about those limitations. And to the extent that that's the way one is deficient in intellectual humility. And so, on our view, it's important that that intellectual humility also involves owning our intellectual limitations. And by owning here, we mean something opposed to being really embarrassed about our intellectual limitations, or doing what we can to conceal them from other people, or being chronically defensive about our limitations. So when someone raises a good objection to our view, if our immediate instinct is just to be defensive or to try to reframe the point in a way that makes it look insulated from the objection, but really it's not, then that's a failure of ownership in our sense. Now, more needs to be said to be sure about this idea of owning our limitations. Very generally, as we describe it, it's a dispositional profile that includes cognitive, behavioral, motivational, and affective responses to an awareness of one's limitations. Adding to that or illustrating that is the idea that owning one's intellectual limitations characteristically, so it doesn't in every case, but it characteristically involves dispositions to then believe that one has the limitations that one has, and to believe that the consequences of our intellectual limitations are indeed attributable to those limitations and not attributable to other people or other factors. It also involves characteristically a disposition to admit or acknowledge one's limitations rather than to hide them or deny them, to care about the fact that one has those limitations and to take their existence and potential consequences seriously. And also, this is the affective dimension, to feel regret and dismay, but maybe not something like hostility or extreme anxiety, say, about one's intellectual limitations. Now, you might begin to wonder whether this concept of owning our limitations is conveniently artificial, right? We might think that, oh, you guys are just taking this notion of what it is to own your limitations and defining it in terms of all the stuff that is obviously inconsistent with intellectual humility, right? And you know, that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, but we don't think that that's quite right. We think that there is a familiar notion of what it is to own one's limitations that's out there in ordinary thought and ordinary discourse that our view is trying to sort of pick out. There is a semi-technical dimension to it, to be sure, but it's not purely artificial or stipulative. Oh, whoops, sorry, well, I'll just skip that. That's the worry is ownership a conveniently artificial concept. And I'm going to talk about 3 different familiar contexts that in which one finds this notion of ownership and the notion of it that fits nicely with our way of thinking about it. So one is in addiction rehabilitation context, where statements like the following aren't uncommon. Owning your addiction means acknowledging to yourself and others that addiction has become a part of your life, that it's part of who you are. Once you're able to acknowledge that and to face up to that difficult fact, you can start to take control of your addiction and your life. Because that's a notion of ownership that doesn't amount to like saying, yeah, I merely acknowledge that I have this problem. It's a way of acknowledging it that involves a kind of taking responsibility for it and involves sort of one eye toward getting beyond it, okay? Which fits very nicely with how we characterize that notion. Secondly, in a relational context, right, we often expect each other to own our role in conflicts and relationship. And so if I'm, say, in an argument with my spouse and you know, I'm just focusing on what I perceive to be her role in the conflict, she might say to me, look, Jason, you need to really own your shit here, right? And if I say, fine, whatever, yeah, I did that wrong, but you did X, Y, and Z, she might say, you're not really owning it, right? So there's this normatively robust notion of ownership in our thinking about interpersonal relations that, again, I think tracks pretty closely what we mean by owning. And finally, in a performance context, whether it's an art performance or a theater performance or an athletic performance, we often, maybe not often enough, but we often hear people using the language of ownership to account for defective performances of one sort or another. So this is from the Miami Heat coach after a 2014 Game 4 loss in the NBA Finals. We didn't play a good basketball game. All of us have owned that. It doesn't matter ultimately how you may lose or what the game is like. You have to learn from it and move on. So again, there's this idea of not going to blame others. We're going to take ownership of it and try to make some sort of constructive use of that. Okay? Move beyond the defect or the poor performance. Now, another feature of our view is that we distinguish between the virtue of intellectual humility and the mere trait or attribute of intellectual humility. So on our view, a person can be intellectually humble in a sense without their intellectual humility really counting as a genuine or full-blown virtue. And to come at this idea, we can just remind ourselves of the familiar Aristotelian point of view, or familiar to the philosophers at least. Aristotle doesn't make this point about intellectual virtues, he makes it about moral virtues, but intellectual virtues, as we're thinking about them, are pretty much structurally analogous to his moral virtues. So a person possesses the virtue of intellectual humility only if she's disposed to be properly attentive to and to own her intellectual limitations in the right way, at the right time, in the right amount, and for the right reason. Okay, so the idea is you don't have the full-blown virtue of intellectual humility unless you're doing what an intellectually humble person does for the right reason. What that suggests in what we defend is a motivational requirement on intellectual humility. So on our view, intellectual humility is a full-blown virtue only when it is motivated by something like a positive orientation, which would typically include something like a desire toward a range of epistemic goods, which would typically include things like truth, knowledge, and understanding. So IH, understood as an intellectual virtue, according to us, is a disposition to be properly attentive to and to own one's intellectual limitations out of a desire for truth. So the virtuously intellectually humble person is someone who wants to get to the truth and has an understanding that they're fallible and that fallibility will only hinder their epistemic aims. And so they're disposed out of a desire for truth and knowledge and understanding to be attentive to and to own their cognitive limitations. A nice illustration of this, which I'll just mention quickly, comes from the book by Bob Roberts and Jay Wood. This is an example that gets cited a lot, but they use it to illustrate their view, which is very different from our view, but I think it illustrates our view just as well. This example of the Cambridge philosopher G.E. Moore. One of his students says about Moore in his lectures was self-effacing. We can quibble about whether that's quite the right word, but she says, criticisms he put forward of claims he himself had made, say in a previous lecture, could as well have been directed to an anonymous philosopher whose mistakes call for attention. So we all know what it's like to make a mistake when we're teaching something or presenting some material to somebody, right? And what we hear about Moore is that when he made a mistake, he was quick to own it, right? So she gives, I won't get into the example, but she gives an interesting example where at the end of one lecture, he's defending, some claim, and he shows up the next class period and says, oh, what I was defending last week, it's totally wrong, and here's why it's wrong, right? So he freely, comfortably is able to admit his own intellectual mistakes or limitations. Now, I'm going to see how far, we're going to just skip over, that's the view in a nutshell. And the view is, fortunately for us, has received a fair amount of uptake or discussion in the literature on intellectual humility since its publication in 2015, and so there are several different objections to it that have already appeared in print. There's in fact an entire paper called, I don't have the title here, called The Limitations of the Limitations Owning Account of Intellectual Humility by Ian Church. And one of the main issue that he takes with our view is that he thinks we're mistaken to restrict the scope of intellectual humility to the ownership of our intellectual limitations. Okay? So for us, IH involves an appropriate responsiveness to our intellectual limitations. proper attentiveness to our intellectual abilities or strengths, say, falls to a different virtue on our view, namely the virtue of proper intellectual pride. However, more than one person has held that humility involves an appropriate responsiveness to one's limitations and strengths. So here's a view. This is about humility, not intellectual humility. Let me slide back and forth between talking about those two different things. But on our view, intellectual humility is really just sort of the species of humility simpliciter. So one authors of one view of humility say, humility involves having an accurate view of self. That's a familiar idea. An accurate view of self, evidenced by honest self-evaluation and willingness to accept one's strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so in his paper, The Limitations of the Limitations Owning Account of Humility, Ian Church argues against the sort of narrow way of thinking about humility's scope, where it's limited to our limitations, and in favor of a broader scope where it includes owning our limitations and strengths. Now here's the problem that I'm up against. There's no way I'm going to be able to get this. There's a fair amount of back and forth. It's going to take me 10 minutes. Okay, I'll maybe get like halfway through this bit. But this is where we'll start to descend into the weeds a little bit. Okay, so here's a first pass at his argument in favor of the wider view of thinking about the scope of humility and against the narrower view. So within a given domain, a person might own his intellectual limitations, get things right with regard to his limitations, while badly overestimating or underestimating his strengths. So you can imagine a person who properly owns his limitations in a given domain, but badly overestimates or underestimates his intellectual strengths or abilities in that domain. So Church argues, if the limits owning view is correct, S would be intellectually humble and also either intellectually arrogant or intellectually servile with respect to that domain. And that's weird. I mean, it's not weird to think that I could be servile or diffident in one domain and properly humble in another domain, but it would be weird to think that I could be both of those things in the same domain. Either of those possibilities seems problematic, so the limits owning view fails. Okay, here's the problem with that objection, I think, and we approached the objection a little bit differently in our paper, but I think this works just as well. It might be a little bit more straightforward way of dealing with the problem. To the extent that this person we're imagining overestimates his abilities, think about what he's doing. If I overestimate my abilities, I'm failing to acknowledge the limitations of those abilities. Right? So by overestimating, by thinking that I'm stronger than I am at something, I'm failing to recognize the limitations that exist on my strengths in that domain. So if the person overestimates his ability in a domain, then he fails to acknowledge the limitations of his abilities in that domain. And so according to the limits owning view, he would count as arrogant. To the extent that someone underestimates his abilities within a domain, he attributes to himself limitations that he doesn't actually have. So if I think about some ability that I have, that ability is more limited than it is, then I'm attributing to myself a limitation that I don't have. And if that's right, then even on the limits owning view, I would be deficient in intellectual humility. Okay, so I think that either way, whether the person that we're imagining is overestimating or underestimating his strengths, the limitations owning view is still in a perfectly good position to say, oh, that person is deficient in intellectual humility, and so the objection doesn't work. But there's a different way of approaching this that I think has a little bit more promise. It's also a way that Church discusses in his paper. Suppose that S owns his limitations in a given domain, but merely suspends judgment about, and therefore doesn't properly own his strengths in that domain. So he's not attributing to himself limitations that he doesn't have, or failing to see limitations on his abilities. He owns his limitations. When it comes to his abilities, he just suspends judgment, and therefore doesn't properly own them. According to Church, if the Limitsonian view is correct, this person might be intellectually humble, but also servile on account of his diffidence, and maybe it's diffidence that we should be talking about as much as servility, but on account of his diffidence about his abilities. Okay? And that seems problematic, and so it seems like a powerful objection to the view. All right. I'm only going to be able to begin to... I'm going to end on a whimper rather than a bang. But so it goes. So here's what I'd say about this case. This is a harder case. First of all, we've got to remember before we jump to any conclusion here, that in the case we're imagining, the person doesn't believe that he's weaker or more limited than he is. Okay? He just doesn't believe one way or another. He doesn't have beliefs one way or another. He suspends judgment about his strengths. He doesn't believe that he's weak. He just doesn't know what to think about whether he's strong. Now, I think one question is whether a person like that should really be considered servile. But even if we do want to say, yeah, he's at least weakly or mildly servile, he'd be more servile if he were thinking that he's worse than he is, but he's a little bit servile just on account of not forming a judgment about his strengths at all. I think we can still raise the question as to whether that servility is properly understood as a deficiency in humility rather than a deficiency of proper intellectual pride. Now you might think, well, if it's one, it has to be the other. So you might be thinking that, oh, well, you know, an excess of humility just is servility. And so if he's at all servile, then that means he must be, at least to some extent, deficient in humility. So I'm going to leave with a picture. I'm going to close with a picture that suggests that that's a bad inference. That servile, therefore deficient in humility, is not quite right. So we offer this this little diagram in our paper, but here's the idea. On our view, proper pride is the virtue that goes along with owning our intellectual strengths. And intellectual humility is a matter of owning our intellectual limitations. But what you see from this is that pride and humility terminate in a common pair of vices. So if you are deficient in pride, you're servile. If you're excessive in pride, you're arrogant. Similarly, if you're excessive in humility, then you're servile. And if you are deficient in humility, then you're arrogant. So my suggestion is that this scenario that we're imagining doesn't tell in favor of the wide view of thinking about intellectual humility's scope versus the narrow view, because it's entirely consistent with the narrow view that the person we're imagining would be at least weakly servile, and it's consistent with that because he could be servile just on account of not being properly prideful. He needn't be deficient in intellectual humility. Now, I have a really good, interesting, I think, decisive objection to the wide view of thinking about the scope of intellectual humility. And it's fun, and there's interesting back and forth, but we'll have to talk about it later because I've got to stop.